This is a newspaper headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer, published on September 5th, 1921, 100 years old. It reads, "Big congregation sits undisturbed as church burns. More than 1,000 persons attending Mass obey priest's orders. Blaze which destroyed shrine is extinguished by firemen. Damages are small." What a striking headline and an interesting story, which I'm going to read part of. The article reads, "More than 1,000 persons attended Mass yesterday morning at the Church of the Most Precious Blood at 28th and Diamond Streets, remained calmly in their pews when a fire started on one of the altars in the church building. The fact that there was no sign of panic among the hundreds of persons hundreds of persons in the church was due solely to the presence of mind of Reverend William O'Donnell, the celebrant of the Mass. When the fire broke out, he calmly turned to the congregation and urged them not to rush for the doors. The church building is absolutely fireproof," the priest announced from the altar. "The flames cannot spread. It is only a question of a few minutes before they burn themselves out." In the meantime, the tongues of flame were shooting towards the ceiling of the edifice, and clouds of smoke were beginning to fill the church. But in spite of this, the hundreds of persons present remained virtually motionless. The fire was caused by a candle falling on an elaborately ornamented shrine. The excessive heat is believed to have caused the candle to bend and drop from its place. In a few seconds, the entire shrine was a mass of flames. And the article continues to describe how everybody just sat there calmly at the orders of the priest, and the firemen eventually showed up and resolved the incident with little damage, and nobody was injured, nobody was hurt. What an interesting story, though. With all due respect to Pastor Jeff, if there's ever a fire that breaks out on a Sunday morning and you tell us all to just stay seated, I'm probably going to head out. No offense. It's an interesting story, and I want you to keep it in mind as we delve into our topic today, which is the topic of fear, and specifically fearing the Lord. So obviously the Bible has a lot to say about the fear of the Lord. Most of us here are believers and have been for quite some time. But I mean, it's full of passages in the Psalms and the Proverbs. I'll read a couple of them. Psalm 111:10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever." Proverbs 1:7, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." Proverbs 14:26, "In the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence." So we're all familiar with the concept. And yet it's still one that seems kind of hard to grasp. How is the fear of the Lord different than being afraid of the Lord? And we're not, again, most of us being believers for some time, we've all heard the common resolution to this question, which is that the fear of the Lord talked about in the Bible is not being afraid in a literal sense of terror or horror, but it's a sort of reverent fear. And so rather than give you the usual message and go into detail about the semantics of this, I thought it might be more useful to instead try to demonstrate the difference, because it is still a hard concept to grasp, a hard difference to reconcile, at least for me, at least in my mind, it's hard to grasp. And so I think that the best way to try to understand the difference is by looking at some analogies. And in order to demonstrate the concept through analogies, I did my best to, I tried to write my own succinct definition of what this distinct kind of fear is, this fear of the Lord, this reverential fear that is referred to often in the Bible. And it wasn't easy to come up with, but here's the best I could do. This type of fear is a reverence and respect for someone or something with specific considerations towards the boundaries that exist in your relationship toward that person or thing. And so let me unpack that and try to defend, if you will, my definition that I've come up with here. And I'll start with my first analogy. Compare your feelings towards a fireplace as opposed to a forest fire. Obviously, the feelings are drastically different. You would run in literal terror from a forest fire, whereas a fireplace you would draw near to, respecting the boundaries that are in place between you and the fire, namely the fireplace itself. So what's the difference? two things in my mind. The first is knowledge, and the second is boundary. A forest fire is out of control. It's unpredictable. There are no boundaries in place to protect you. To protect you. You don't know what it's going to do next, what's going to happen next. Whereas the fireplace is a very controlled environment, and again, there is that boundary, the fireplace itself, to protect you from the flame inside. The fire itself is no less dangerous in either case, but your difference in emotion, your difference in response to it, to this danger, is drastically different because, again, you have knowledge, there's not that element of unpredictableness, and because there's a boundary in place. So referring back to the newspaper headline that we just read, the reason that the congregation didn't react in terror, which is usually the normal response invoked by a building catching on fire, occupied by hundreds of people, is because the priest immediately gave them two things. He gave them knowledge and he gave them a boundary. He informed them about the parameters of the situation, and he informed them about a boundary that at least he perceived, which is that the church isn't flammable, where the fire isn't likely to spread, and so we're not in danger. And so just being armed with this knowledge and with this at least perceived boundary, it made the difference between causing people to react in panic and to be afraid versus their response, which was calm. And but I would argue that they still had a sort of almost that sort of respect or reverential fear for the fire. I mean, nobody walked up to touch the fire. They didn't say, well, the priest said that there's no problem, so I'm just going to go and sit down next to the fire. They still understood the danger that the fire represented, and they did not take that for granted. They didn't consider the fire to be something not worthy of their concern, but they reacted differently, again, because they remained within these boundaries that they now saw within the situation. I'll use another analogy. Consider your feelings towards a wild dog versus a pet dog. Again, you would run in fear from a wild dog, whereas a pet dog you're going to approach, most people would approach without a problem. But again, respecting the boundaries in place, being careful not to pet him too hard, being careful not to pull his tail. Both are equally capable of harming you, and yet one you run from and the other you run towards. So what's the difference? Again, knowledge and boundaries. A wild dog is out of control. It's unpredictable. There are no boundaries in place in that relationship to protect you. But a pet dog, once you've known him for long enough, is predictable. You know what he likes, what he dislikes. There's a relationship there. And as long as you consider the boundaries of that relationship, then you don't have, you're not afraid of the dog. People live with pet dogs in the house, and they're not constantly cowering in terror, hiding beneath the bed. They come to love the dog and to accept it as part of the family. This animal that, again, is no less capable of harming you than the dog out in the wild who has rabies. But the difference, again, is knowledge and a boundary that's in place. So aside from these physical examples, I think that these types of fear can be demonstrated in relationships as well. It's as simple as looking at the difference between being literally afraid of an abusive father who is unpredictable and who respects no boundaries whatsoever, and being reverent towards a good and loving father, one around whom you feel safe, because while he is still capable of punishing you, he is predictable in his actions, and you know that he will not overstep any boundaries in his execution of that punishment. And I believe that both of these types of fear towards an authority figure can be demonstrated or are demonstrated in the parable of the talents that Jesus gives us in Matthew 25. Starting in verse 14, again, it will be like a man, referring to the kingdom of heaven, will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another one bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant, so you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So we can see the wicked servant, his attitude towards his master was one not of a reverent fear, but he was afraid of his master. He was afraid of what his master might do to him if he should lose this 1 bag of gold that he had been entrusted with. And it certainly isn't a reverent fear. There's certainly no respect that he has towards his master. The accusations that he brings towards his master, essentially accusing him of being a thief, he overstepped the boundaries of the relationship. And you can just picture this disrespectful man sitting in the break room and making similar accusations, talking about his boss behind his back to his coworkers. There's absolutely no respect. There's not that sense of reverential fear, but again, he is afraid of the punishment. And he believed his master to be a hard man, and compare that to the reality of the situation that we see and how his master deals with the other 2 who prove themselves faithful, and he tells them, come enter into your master's happiness. That doesn't sound like the response of a hard man who's not deserving of respect. So if our definition of this type of fear of the Lord and the difference between, again, being afraid and fearing the Lord, if the definition follows, then this wicked servant must have been lacking knowledge and boundaries. And again, he didn't seem to know his master very well. He had a very different idea of what his master would do, how his master would react, than evidently the other 2 servants did. This wicked man's lack of knowledge led him to overstep the boundaries of the relationship, again, treating his master and speaking to him very disrespectfully. And it was according to his own words that he was eventually punished, at least according to the parallel parable told in Luke. It was this crossing of the boundary that ultimately sealed his fate. He pulled the dog's tail, so to speak. He stepped into the fireplace. He overstepped his boundaries. But again, the wise servants exemplify reverence and respect, but they're no less aware of the power and authority of their master. They're just also aware of his goodness. That's the difference. And so I believe that knowledge and boundaries are what make the difference between being afraid of God and having this reverential fear of God. I think the difference between the man who is afraid of God and the man who fears God is slight. Both men rightly understand that God can destroy them. The difference is that the first man will run away from God to avoid being destroyed, while the other man will run to God, not because he thinks that God is incapable of destroying him, but because he knows that God promised not to do so, provided that we keep within the boundaries that God put in place for how we are to approach him. The former man, the wicked man, has no knowledge of these boundaries, or he does, perhaps worse, he does, and he chooses to overstep them. And so when we're talking about our relationship with God in terms of knowledge and boundaries, I would say that the primary boundary that God has given us in our relationship with him is Jesus Christ himself. Jesus is the fireplace that allows us to draw near the raging fire. We can't approach any other way. If you were to try to warm up by approaching the fireplace through the chimney, things wouldn't go so well for you. Jesus is the way. He is the specified way, and he is the boundary set in place to literally shield us from the wrath of God. He took it on himself. Apart from being this boundary, Jesus also represents the knowledge that we need. In him we have the image of the invisible God, We are given the knowledge of God to know exactly who he is, what he's about, and what to expect in our pursuit of him. And of course, the second major boundary that God has put in place between, again, in our relationship towards him is his word, which, again, arms us with knowledge about him and about how we are to act as those in relationship with him. The man who truly fears God, understanding the humble position in which he finds himself, would not dare to cross the boundaries put in place by the object of his reverence. If a lion invited you to pet him, you wouldn't dare start pulling on his tail, but not just because you know how sharp his claws are, but also because you are humbled by the invitation by such a mighty beast with such power, and you wouldn't dare cross that boundary any more than you would be willing to blatantly and deliberately insult a host who had welcomed you into their home. And so as we grow in our understanding of God's might and his goodness, we will grow in our genuine desire to avoid overstepping these boundaries. And I believe that this is key in fighting addiction. The more that we revere him, the less we will desire our sin, and the more that we become aware of his might, his power, and as a result of how powerful he is, we start to understand just how gracious he is by letting us approach him. And so the more that we understand this dynamic, the less we're going to want to overstep those boundaries. Again, not just because we're afraid of his ability to punish us, but because we're simply in awe of how such a mighty being who how dare we even approach him would invite us to come near him. And to truly fear the Lord does require being invited to come close enough so that we are in danger and we can truly understand who it is we're dealing with, and then truly develop that awe and reverence for him. And we are constantly being invited into that position through the Scripture. All of those verses that I read at the beginning, which encourage us to develop this fear of the Lord, they are invitations to do just that. To accept the invitation is an exercise in both humility and in faith. How did you learn that fire was hot? Most children, as much as you try to keep them away from the stovetop, eventually they're going to find their way to it, and they learn they touch the hot stove, and hopefully that's the only time that happens. They understand that fire is hot, the stove is hot. This is something that I have to treat with respect, and I have to approach it in a certain way. But by being near a fire, by drawing close to it, is also how you learn that fire is something that gives us warmth, and it provides light for us. By being near fire and learning that fire is hot, this didn't. Nobody here, most people here, didn't touch fire once. Fire bad, fire burns, and all of a sudden you developed a lifelong phobia to fire that causes you to panic and never associate with it again. But you learn to respect it, again, as long as these boundaries are in place, as long as you approach it in the specified manner and armed with the knowledge of how to do so. So let's not make the same mistake that the wicked servant did in that parable. He didn't really know his master. And the irony of the situation perhaps is that his fear kept him at a distance and prevented him from truly getting to know his master. But rather than cowering in fear and refusing to approach, let's draw near to God, taste and see that he is good, and our reverence will grow. We'll learn that while he is not safe, he is good. Again, just like the fire, it is not unless we approach fire, we go near to it, that we learn that it is good, but that it is dangerous. And so if we want to learn the same, if we want to be able to grasp the same concept about God, how else but to draw near to him, to see how powerful, how dangerous he is, but also how good he is. So we're teaching, of course, through this book, Banquet in the Grave, it's called, and this is chapter 8, which is entitled "Fearing the Lord." And to be honest, I didn't pull much from the chapter, but I did take one quote out of it, so I'll read this to you. While the holiness of God will leave many knees knocking when Jesus comes again, a mature fear of the Lord is more akin to awe, devotion, and worship. It is a response that says, "Your glory is irresistible. In your presence, nothing else matters." You are all that I desire. Furthermore, it is a response that is active. It does something. It is not simply a passive devotion. It follows Christ in obedience. It searches out his will and can't wait to do it. I think that's a great description of this fear that we're trying to define here. And in order to get to that place, to search out, to be willing, to be eager to search out his will, and then to be even more eager to do it, again, it requires that we come to know God, that we draw near to him. And so I'll encourage everybody, as I seem to do a lot in my messages, that if you are here, or if you are watching online, or if you are watching a recording after the fact, then take heart, because you have already taken one step closer to the fire. This group here, we're here to represent God. We are perhaps the embers on the edge of the fireplace. We're trying to remain near him, to draw closer to him, so that our own flame remains bright. And by the same token, embers clumped together they're going to heat each other. We can't separate from one another. That's how you put out a fire, is by separating all of the glowing embers. But if you, that's who we are. That's what we represent. We're trying to get as close to the fire as we can within those boundaries. We're trying to reflect that light. We're trying to draw other people into it. And so if you are, again, if you've listened to this message, then you have already taken a step in the right direction. And I encourage you to continue coming here, continue reaching out, continue inquiring, and continue in community with these other believers.